All right. Let's pick up with Chapter 6. So, Chapter 6, land use controls, is going to be very, very minimal information that you need to know the things we talk about here in Chapter 6, but very minimal things for you to focus on here in Chapter 6. Hopefully you're finding this helpful so far, this kind of distilling down, targeting down. Okay, so land use controls come in two different varieties, public and private. The public ones are enforced by the government. So what's the biggest example of a public land use control? Zoning. What's the biggest example of a private land use control? Restrictive covenants, protective covenants. And who enforces those covenants? What if the HOA, but what if there is no HOA? Any owner within that same subdivision can enforce those covenants on any other owner within the subdivision, correct? Do they have to prove like they're being harmed by the other person who's violating the covenants or anything like that? No. You just have to show they're breaking the rule. That's it. And you have the right to enforce them. So when we talk about zoning, what's an extraterritorial jurisdiction? An area outside of the city limits where they still have zoning authority, right? So good. They still have zoning authority even though it's not within their corporate limits. Now, when we talk about zoning, generally speaking, zoning has certain uses that they call allowed uses. If something's not an allowed use and you start to do it, what is it called? It's an illegal use. If you start doing it and the zoning says you can't do it, that's an illegal use. And does it ever change once it's an illegal use? Is it ever like, oh, you've been doing it so long, you might as well just do it now? Does it work that way? No, it does not. So, once illegal, always illegal. Make sure you're aware of that. What is a legal non-conforming use? You started doing it when? When it was legal. And then it turned to an illegal use, but you were already doing it, so you're grandfathered in. That's a legal non-conforming use. Bless you. Is everybody good with that? So make sure you know the difference between a legal non-conforming use and an illegal use. What is a variance? Permission to do what? What is zoning? It's a list of things I what? Can and can't do. So what is a variance? If I'm asking them to vary the zoning, what am I asking for? Allow me to do something that what? That's not allowed. That's what a variance is. It's asking permission to do something that's not allowed. Asking for permission to break the rules. You do have to show a hardship for that. It's very hard to obtain a variance.
What would be considered a hardship?
You cannot use the property for any other use. Any. Literally, any. It has to be completely worthless without the variance. It's a pretty high bar. Okay? That's about all you need to know about zoning, with the exception of this. Does zoning trump covenants? In other words, does zoning take priority over covenants? No. Do covenants take priority over zoning?
Wait, it's whichever's more restrictive,
right? Right. So the answer is neither one of them take priority over the other. When you ask somebody, which do I have to follow, the zoning or the covenants, the answer is always what? The more restrict, and that's just another way of saying both. You got to follow both. You can't violate either one of them. So if the zoning happens to be more restrictive, that's the one you follow. If the covenants have to be more restrictive, which they usually are, that's the one you follow. But neither one of them takes priority over the other. You got to follow all the restrictions. They're just different sets of restrictions. Most likely not, but so what is a building permit?
Basically to build something.
Permission to build something, right? A permit is permission to build. What is a certificate of occupancy?
So that's actually after you've got the approval for it to do the building on that piece of parcel or land.
Yep. Not only have you gotten the approval to do it, what else have you done? You built it. You built it. So a certificate of occupancy is an inspection where they verify that you have completed it according to the building codes. Permit comes before you build. Certificate of occupancy comes when? After. After. When you complete. All right. That's all you need to know about zoning. Now, on page 118 and 119, you have the subdivision process. Oh, there you go. Street disclosure laws. There you go. Are on page 120. So, subdivision rules. First of all, what is a subdivision in North Carolina? When you divide land into what? Two or more pieces of land. Any division of land is a subdivision. What is the step one of that process? To record what? A preliminary, I can't talk, plat map. A preliminary plat map of that new subdivision. Before you record the preliminary plat map, do you have anything? No, you don't. There's nothing there. So as a broker, what can you do before you have a preliminary plat map recorded? How are you going to negotiate a contract for nothing? What would you be negotiating a contract on? This thing that may or may not exist? Right? So what can you do as a broker when you don't have a preliminary plat map? Take their name and call them back when you do have a preliminary plat map recorded. Does that make sense for everybody? So step one before you can do anything relating to that thing is record a preliminary plat map. Now, once you've got a preliminary plat map recorded, what can you do at that point in time? Take deposits. What else? Write contracts. All of those things. But you can't close. I can't transfer title of any lot. Remember, it's not going to be just one lot. A plat map is a whole subdivision, correct? I can't transfer a single property until I do what with my plat map? Finalize it. Record the final version of my plat map. And the thing that changes when it goes from preliminary to final is that I can no longer make changes. The whole plat map has to be redone. If you make one change on any lot, and you can only make that during the preliminary phase. Changes can only be made. That's the whole purpose of recording a preliminary one and then having a time period until you go to a final one. You can only make changes while it's preliminary. Okay, is everybody good on that process? And what you can do as a broker? Good. No, it will not remain preliminary until, because remember, you can't transfer title on a single lot until you have recorded a final plat map. So as soon as they need to, so like in the case of a new home subdivision, as soon as they finish the first house and they're ready to sell it, ready to close on it, they have to record the final plat map because they can't transfer title till they do, which is why they keep plat maps very small. You won't have 100 lots on a plat map. You might have 10 or 12 or 15 because they have to keep it in manageable buckets so that they can make changes on future plat maps. Okay, we talked about the subdivision streets. There it is on page 120. It took them 3 pages to say dedication and acceptance. Let's see here. We talked about deed restrictions. We've already talked about certificate of occupancy and building permits. And then we get to private land use controls, which the most common example, as we've said, are covenants. Covenants are private land use controls. Who places the covenants on the property? Builder, developer. Those are all words for somebody Who is that somebody at the time? What's the more common word for a builder? Developer. How about owner? So you need to make that connection, folks. It's not because they're a builder or a developer that they get to put covenants on the property. It's because they what? They own it. They can do whatever they damn well please with it. It's theirs. So can you go put a covenant or restriction on your property tomorrow at the county courthouse? Of course you can. And guess what? It would be appurtenant. And every owner of that property from now till the end of time would have to honor that restriction. For me, I may go just put a covenant. You cannot paint anything red on my house just because I don't ever want to see red on for obvious reasons. That color in me just don't. Which is probably the color we're going to see when we play them in football this year. But I could put that restriction on my property, and every subsequent owner would have to honor it because it's the owner of the property who has the ability. Because when you place those restrictions, when you convey, these are deed restrictions. So you place them when you write a deed to a new owner, you put that restriction on it. Does that make sense for everybody?
So in the condominium, everybody owns it, but HOA would have the condominiums. They could enforce that, right?
Who could enforce that?
HOA?
It could enforce covenants?
Yeah.
Sure, an HOA could enforce covenants, but does it have to be the HOA?
Well, it can't be the owners.
Sure it can. It can be any owner within that subdivision.
No, in condominium.
Same thing. Any owner. Any owner. You do not have to wait for the HOA to act. That is the beauty of being an owner. You have the right to enforce those same restrictions. Just like you're restricted by them, you have the right to make sure the other people follow them as well. The beauty / downfall of restrictive covenants. Okay, is everybody good on that? All it takes is one owner to enforce them. That's it. That's it. Told you I was quick, chapter 6. Here we go indeed. Agency. There might be a couple questions on the exam. 1 or 30. So, agency relationships. Remember, in North Carolina, who has the agency relationship? Who is the agent in this state? The firm. In a real estate transaction, the firm is always the agent of the client. And so we talk about the different agency possibilities in North Carolina. Now, before we get into the different real estate agent possibilities, let's talk about some broader agency terms. Let's talk about the difference between universal agency, general agency, and special agency. Particularly the difference between general agency and special agency. That is one where people traditionally get confused about what is the role of a real estate broker. Are we general agents or are we special agents? We are most always special agents, meaning that we have what authority to act on behalf of our clients? None. We have no authority whatsoever as a special agent to act on behalf of our clients. We do what we are told to do. That is almost always the case. What's the one exception to that for real estate brokers? Property management. In property management situations, we are most often what kind of agents? General agents, and that is because we have power now. The power to do what? Sign leases, select tenants, negotiate, all those things on behalf of our client. If I sign a lease on behalf of my client, does my client have to honor it? Yes. My name on that lease has the same legal effect as their name on that lease. So that is significantly more power than special agency would be. Does everybody understand that? Good. Good. So, remember when we talk about agency relationships in North Carolina, they come in fours, right? What are the 4 possibilities from a firm's perspective? What are the 4 ways that a real estate firm could participate in a real estate transaction? Exclusive buyer agency. So in an exclusive buyer agency situation, from a firm's perspective, there's only one firm involved in the transaction, and that firm represents who? The buyer. What's another? Exclusive seller agency. So from the firm's perspective, there's only one firm involved in the transaction. That firm and all the agents within that firm or brokers within that firm represent who? The seller. And the buyer would be unrepresented. What's the third example? I hear a couple of them. I hear co-brokered and I hear dual. Those are the last 2, right? So we'll talk about dual and then we'll do co-brokered. In a dual agency transaction, how many firms are involved? Still just one. So far it's only been 1, correct? One firm, one firm, one firm. But now, instead of one firm, one client, it's one firm, what? 2 clients. One firm has representation of both clients. And then the last possibility, as Adam said, is the co-brokered transaction, which is actually the most common one. In the co-brokered transaction is the first time we've introduced how many firms? 2 firms, one representing the buyer and the other representing the seller. Those are the 4 agency choices that are available from the standpoint of the firm. Now, from the standpoint of the client, there's also how many choices available? 4, right? There are 4 choices available from the standpoint of the client. So from the standpoint of a seller client, what is the best possible agency choice? Sub-agency of the seller, but what do we call that generally from the seller's perspective? Exclusive seller agency, right? Exclusive seller agency. Everybody got that? That means the firm and everybody within the firm represents me. Now, there may or may not be representation for somebody on the other side of the transaction, because I'm not talking about from the firm's perspective anymore. I'm not talking about whether it's co-brokered or not. I'm talking about from the client's perspective. Does everybody understand what I mean? So from the client's perspective, exclusive seller agency means that everybody within the firm is on my team as the seller. And the buyer might have representation, but if they do, it's some other real estate firm. And I don't care. What's the next best option from the seller's perspective? Designated dual agency. In designated dual agency, I still have advice from one broker within the firm. Correct? What's the next option for? True dual agency. In a true dual agency situation, I don't have advice from anybody within the firm, but I also don't have anybody who's doing what? Working against me. Everybody in the firm is neutral. So no advice, but also no damage. And then what's the worst possible? From the seller's perspective, FSBO's bad? Yeah. Yeah. Because the seller's what? The seller's unrepresented. That's exactly right. I'm just testing you to see how sure you are of it. Exactly right. We go all the way from exclusive seller agency to FSBO. That's the gamut, right? Because in the FSBO situation, if there's a real estate firm involved, who are they working for? They're on the other side of the transaction working against me, right? So now let's do it from the buyer's perspective. The thing that was worst for the seller, FSBO, is what to the buyer? Is best for the buyer. It's not seller subagent. It's exclusive what? Exclusive buyer agency. See, those are opposite sides of the same coin, right? From the buyer's perspective, a FSBO is exclusive buyer agency, because if there's a real estate firm involved, they got to be on one side or the other. Does that make sense? So exclusive buyer agency. And then what's the next best choice? Designated dual agency. And then true dual agency. And then what's the worst choice from the buyer's perspective? Well, seller subagency, which happened to be the best choice for the seller. They're mirrors of each other. Those are the 4 choices that are available in any transaction. Okay? that make sense for everybody? We're good with that? Now, one of the things you need to remember about our job is it's our job to make the clients aware of all of those choices. We have to explain to them what those options are, what choices they have available. When do we do that? First substantial contact. Using what document? Working with real estate agents brochure. And actually the brochure, does it create an agency relationship? Is it a contract of any type? No. All it is proof that you've gone over those choices with them. That's the best way to describe the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure. It's proof that you actually did talk to them about those choices. Okay? And they do not have to sign it. All right? Good. What's the difference between a customer and a principal or client? You owe fiduciary duties to a client. Customer, you don't. Client is someone you represent. Customer is someone you don't represent. Good. Good. What is implied agency and why is it dangerous? Zach said, I just turned myself into somebody's agent by basically acting like I had the ability to be that. Isn't that a good definition of implied agency? So I'll give you an example of that. I'm not the property manager, but somebody calls me and says, hey, my heat's broken, and I go over there and I fix it for them. What have I just implied? That I'm the property manager. And guess what? I just became the property manager. How about if I submit an offer on behalf of a buyer? What have I implied? That I represent the buyer. And the reason I've implied it is because what does the rule say about submitting an offer for a buyer? You have to have a written buyer agency agreement. So if I'm submitting an offer on behalf of that buyer, am I not implying to whoever I'm submitting that offer to that I have a buyer agency agreement with this person? That's an example of implied agency. You don't ever want to do that. You don't ever want to be caught in that. Don't act like you have the authority to do that when you don't. Okay? So what duties do we owe to our clients? Disclosure and skill, care, and diligence, right? Loyalty, obedience, accounting, disclosure, skill, care, and diligence. Those are what we owe to our exclusive clients. If we're exclusive seller representatives or if we're exclusive buyer representatives, we owe them those things. So do we owe them disclosing, telling what we know about the other side? Like if I represent the seller, should I tell them if the buyer is willing to pay more money? Yeah. Absolutely. Do I owe them a duty of accountability with looking after their money? Does that include the closing statement? Like verifying the things I can verify on the closing statement? Do I owe them the duty of advice if I'm an exclusive representative? Absolutely. Do I guarantee them that nothing bad's going to happen to them? No. Do I guarantee them that I'm going to disclose every single material fact in a transaction? No. I'm going to disclose the ones I can what? That I reasonably could have known about. Okay? So know where that line ends. And by the way, notice those duties are only there in exclusive agency. If we're talking about dual agency, do a lot of those duties go away or change? Absolutely. Especially the disclosure ones. And what one goes away completely? Advice. That duty of advice goes away completely when we go into dual agency. All right? Yeah, go ahead.
The accounting part, like going over the closing statement, do you go through both the buyer and seller if you're representing both in a dual?
So Adam's question is, if I'm representing both sides, do I need to check both sides of the closing statement? And the answer would be yes.
Okay.
Yep, I need to check both sides. Yep. Material facts on page 144. This is the disclosure part of the deal. So basically there are some things that we disclose only to our clients. That's basically the stuff we know about the other side. But then there are some things that we disclose to everybody. We call those things material facts. Material facts we disclose to everybody whether our clients want us to or not. Those are the things that generally they don't want us to disclose. So when we incorrectly disclose them, we call that in either a misrepresentation or an omission, correct? Either a misrepresentation or an omission. So somebody define misrepresentation for me. I say something and that something is wrong. That's a misrepresentation. What is an omission? I say nothing. Good. We're halfway home. What is willful? I knew at the time I did it that I was doing it wrong. Right? So they would use words like, Travis was told, Travis knowingly, Travis was informed and did it anyway. That's willful language. Negligent language is words like forgot, having forgotten, without checking. That's all negligence. Because if I didn't check, could I possibly know? If somebody asks me, does the dishwasher work? And I say, yeah, absolutely, the dishwasher works. How would that be willful? What would it take for that to be a willful misrepresentation? I had to have checked the dishwasher and established and absolutely knew that it did not work. Otherwise, I'm just saying something that could be true or could not be true. That's negligence. Does that make sense for everybody? Yes? Right, so like my client, told me, for example, the seller told me, dishwasher doesn't work. We're not replacing it, but it doesn't work. And I put that down in my notes, and I don't put it in the MLS. What is that? I didn't say I forgot. I said I put it down in my notes, and I didn't put it in the MLS. That's a willful what? Omission. That would be a willful omission, because I knew. Travis was aware. Travis knew. There would be some language like that.
But if they say they don't know if dishwasher works, and you say it does,
that makes it negligent. Because when I said it worked, I had a 50-50 chance of what? Being right. I could have guessed right. And if there's any chance at all that I could have guessed right, it's negligence. The key with willful is there's a 100% chance I'm wrong. And I knew it at that time. Because the answer I'm given, I know is the wrong answer. I literally just tried to use the dishwasher 5 minutes ago. And it smoked. I know it doesn't work. That's a willful act. Okay? So make sure you're careful with those. How do we terminate agency relationships? And we know we create them with written agreements in most cases. Somebody fires somebody else? Yeah. Completing the task. That's one big way to terminate an agency relationship. So if I'm hired to list a house, what's the best way to terminate that listing agreement? Sell the house. If I'm hired as a buyer agent, the best way to terminate that buyer agency agreement is to let them buy a house, close on something. So fulfillment of the purpose or doing what I was hired to do is a big one there. What's another way agency agreements can end? Mutual agreement. So both parties agree to release one another. And then what's the last one? They all have to have some kind of a date on them. They all have to have an expiration date. What about 14 days?
I was going to say, never mind, that's for...
You talking about the closing? Okay, yeah. There's no time periods associated with it. So, an expiration date. Now, if another thing that would terminate an agency agreement would be death of the client. Obviously, if the client dies, then that terminates the listing or buyer agency agreement. But how about if the broker dies? No, because who actually represents the client? The firm does. So death of the broker has nothing to do with it. So sad. We move on. Just get him out of the front foyer. We got an open house this afternoon. On page 147, they mention stigmatized properties. Stigmatized properties. So, when we talk about stigmatized properties, are these material facts in North Carolina? They are not material facts. So, are we obligated to disclose them? No, we are not. So, like, for example, give me some examples of stigmatized properties. The property's what? Property's haunted. Somebody died in the house. Somebody got sick in the house. Sex offender lives next door. None of somebody had HIV who lived in the house. None of those are material facts, okay? So, if on a test they ask you to identify material facts, don't choose any of those. Okay, those all are not material facts. Anything relating to being haunted, somebody died there, somebody was sick there, there's a sex offender there, none of those are material facts about the property.
The buyer says, I don't want to buy a house that somebody died.
Right, they could specifically make it a material fact, but in general, none of these things are. All right, is everybody good with that? Make sure you are as far as the test goes. On page 151, we talked about cooperating transactions or cooperating brokers. Just remember that's when two firms are involved. Whenever you see that phrase, a cooperating firm or cooperating broker, that just means a different firm. Okay? So also, here's a connection to make. If they say cooperating firm, are we talking about a dual agency transaction? No, because if there's a cooperating firm, that means there's at least how many firms involved? Two. That means the buyer and the seller have different representation. Does that make sense for everybody? So be careful of that kind of language. Be careful of the kind of language on a test where they say, you know, Travis is affiliated with a firm that does not practice buyer agency. Well, if he's still working in the transaction, folks, whose team is he on? The seller's team. I don't care what they tell you that he's doing. He could be doing handstands in the buyer's driveway. It don't matter. If they say he's affiliated with a firm that doesn't practice buyer agency and he's still working in the transaction, there's only two teams and they told you he's not on one. You see what I mean? So be very careful when you read those agency-based. The most common mistakes are just not paying attention to the way they word those things. Okay? Is everybody good with that? Good. And by the way, if his firm doesn't practice buyer agency, does his firm practice dual agency? No, because the dual agency is representing both the buyer and the seller. Dual agency is a form of buyer agency. Okay? So be very careful with that. As far as compensation, we do not care where the compensation comes from in a transaction. Our representation is not dictated by our compensation. So what that simply means is, it doesn't matter who pays us. What matters is who we have an agency agreement with, and ultimately who we have a written agency agreement with, because don't we ultimately have to have a written agency agreement in every transaction? Sure. We have to have them with sellers from the very beginning. Listing agreements always have to be in writing. Buyers, we could work with them orally for a certain amount of time, but eventually we have to put it in writing as soon as we do what for them? As soon as we present an offer, we'd have to reduce that to writing. Good. Good. As far as compensation, do we have to disclose it? Yes. Like what compensation? Just commissions or bonuses, trips? All of it. And we have to disclose it how? In writing. In writing. It has to be disclosed in writing. Well, there's a lot of ways we can do it in writing, correct? How do we do it in writing? Buyer agency agreement, listing agreement. What else? How about just an email? Is that in writing?
Yes.
Yeah. A text message. Is that in writing? A handwritten love note. Is that in writing? Yes. Anything in writing. The rule just says in writing. It doesn't say it has to be on a particular form, but it does say it better not be on a particular form. What form had it better not be on? A sales contract. It's a good thing to disclose your commission. You're supposed to do it. But there's a place you're not supposed to do it, because sales contracts can't have any reference at all to commissions. Those pre-printed forms we use, we're not allowed to put anything on there about commission, even if it's something that we think we're doing a good thing and saying, hell, we're being paid this much money. It's a good thing to do, but the wrong place to do it. Does that make sense for everybody? What else can you not put on a sales contract? A liability what? Like a waiver, right? You can't sue me. It ain't my fault. A liability waiver for who? The brokers. That's exactly right. We can't have any kind of a liability waiver built into the contract. Basically, what the Real Estate Commission is telling us there is we are liable. We are very much liable, and we cannot have a contract that says we're not liable. If you don't want to be liable, then get out of the transaction. Okay? Is everybody good with that?
All compensation has to be in writing before the offer.
Yes, that's a really good question. So the question was, when do we have to disclose all compensation in writing? Think about when the most important time to disclose everything is. Before we place an offer. And compensation is the same way. And here's the thought process behind that. We don't want the buyer to come back after they're already under contract and go, well, if I had known that, I never would have offered. So we always take care of all of our disclosures and get all that stuff out of the way before they make an offer. That way they're making an offer with all of the information. So the time to do it in writing is before they make an offer. What I actually do in the real world is I just give them the agent info sheet when I'm done showing them the property, because the agent info sheet that I print out of the MLS has the commission printed right on there, what they're offering as far as commission goes. And I show them where it is. When I show them the first house, I say, by the way, this number down here at the bottom, this commission to buyer's agent, that's what they're offering as far as compensation. And I give them every one of them. So, see, and that's an interesting question, because I've had other agents ask me that thing. Well, there's agent-only comments on there. I said, so what kind of things do you put in the agent-only comments? Well, if there's stuff that needs to be disclosed, I usually put it in there. Stuff that needs to be disclosed to who? Who are we disclosing it to? I would hope the buyer, right? So in my opinion, there's not anything on that sheet that a buyer shouldn't know. So there should not be. I cannot imagine what it would possibly be. So I just give them the agent-only version, because then I can legitimately say the buyer knows everything that I do. There. Yeah, I give it to them, but for that, for that reason. And sometimes I even just circle the commission on the bottom until they get used to where to find it, because it's in the same place on every time. That way I don't have to worry about. And another thing I do is when they actually make an offer, because I'm sending everything digital signatures, I include the listing sheet in there and drop a signature panel on the listing sheet. So I've got a signed version of it that shows. If somebody ever said, I didn't know you were getting paid this, well, you should have. You signed this, and it's right there on the bottom of that page. So, it's a good idea to do those kinds of things. So you never, especially if you get into a situation like with a builder who's offering a bonus, or because builders are a lot of times do things that really can come off as sketchy to buyers. And the builders don't mean to be. They're just trying to move inventory. But, sometimes builders will say, $5,000 bonus if it's under contract by October 10th. Well, the buyer may not care about that if you tell them about it right now. But let them go under contract and find out after the fact. What are they going to immediately say? Well, no wonder you were in such a damn hurry. That's just human nature, right? I guess you were in a hurry. Yeah. Great house, huh? Sure. So it's better to just get it out there before they make an offer, which is what's required anyway, and just get it out there. Okay? Is everybody okay on dual agency and the idea that it has to be disclosed, fully disclosed, and you have to get what kind of permission in order to practice it? In order to practice it. So let me define practicing dual agency. Practicing dual agency means we've got an offer. That's practicing dual agency. So what kind of permission do we need for that? Written permission from both sides of the transaction. Now, in most cases, and I'm going to tell you the one exception here. In most cases, can you get oral permission for dual agency? Yes. There is one exception to that rule. Now, of course, we always have to put it in writing before we present an offer, right? I think everybody understands that. When we talk about oral permission for dual agency, we're really just talking about oral permission to do what with the property? To show it. To show them the property, knowing that if they did make an offer, it would be a dual agency transaction. We can normally get oral permission for that. There's one exception. If we've got a written agency agreement with both clients, and we always have one with the seller because we couldn't have the listing if we didn't have one. If they both said no to dual agency in writing, then you got to get permission in writing. Does that make sense for everybody? And so in other words, the buyer signed a listing agreement and they said, I don't authorize dual agency. The seller signed a listing agreement, the buyer signed a buyer agency agreement, and they said, I don't authorize dual agency. You can't get oral permission at that point because you got two no's. You got to get that permission in writing even to show the property. But any other case, any other situation, you can get oral permission.
So basically it started out in oral, it could follow all the way through oral
Until an offer. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, is everybody good on that? As far as that, don't engage in undisclosed dual agency. What would undisclosed dual agency be? You don't tell them. So maybe I have a listing and I have a buyer that comes to me who wants to make an offer on the property. And I agree to represent the buyer. And I never mentioned to the seller that I also represent this buyer. And so the buyer makes a low offer because I encouraged him to make an offer. First of all, am I wrong in encouraging them to do anything? Yeah. And so I encourage them to make an offer. And then I take this low offer to the seller. And I never tell the seller that I also represent this buyer. And the seller is like, oh, this is a terrible offer. And I say, yeah, but you know, you might not see a better one. Have I also messed up there? Yes. I have engaged in a whole lot of wrong things there, right? Number one, first and foremost, that's undisclosed dual agency. Does that make sense? Secondly, not only am I doing it undisclosed, I'm doing it wrong. Because I'm giving what? Advice. Advice. So look out for those kinds of things on the test. Obviously, that would be huge violations to do that. How about designated dual agency? In designated dual agency, the firm still represents the buyer and the seller. Correct? The firm still represents the buyer and the seller. But what are we doing? We're peeling off the brokers now. One broker is going to represent the buyer, and a different broker within the firm is going to represent the seller. What's the biggest rule about those people we designate? They can't know what? Anything that would hurt the opposite side. If I'm being designated to represent the buyer, I can't know anything that would hurt the seller. If I'm being designated to represent the seller, I can't know anything that would hurt the buyer. Biggest rule about dual agency, or designated dual agency rather. And in that case, the two brokers would act as if they worked in different firms once they've been designated. Who can be a designated dual agent? Who can be? Any two brokers within the same firm, with the exception of one thing. A provisional and their BIC. That's the only exception. So any two brokers within the same firm, because obviously it's still dual agency, right? They have to work at the same place for it to be designated dual agency. So any two brokers within the same firm could be designated dual agents with the exception of a provisional broker designated against their broker in charge. Can two provisional brokers be designated dual agents? Can two non-provisional brokers? Can the BIC and a non-provisional broker? Yes. Any combination works except PB, BIC. That's the only one that doesn't work. Good deal. Good deal. On page 166, we talk about the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure. Obviously, with the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure, that's what we use to disclose our agency relationships. That's what we use to prove that we've given them the choices. when do we give them those choices?
First
First substantial contact. No later than first substantial contact. And first substantial contact is when they give us personal confidential information, right? So ideally, it would actually be better if we did it before we got personal confidential information, because the rule is no later than first substantial contact. Does that make sense for everybody? So on a test, ideally you'd like to do this. You'd like to give them this disclosure even before they give you personal information. Not at first face-to-face contact, but before they give you personal information. Just saying hi is not first substantial contact. Not before you give them any information about a property. Remember, you can give them all the information about property you want to. It's that personal information. That's what you're looking for. That's the key to first substantial contact. What transactions, please, do we use the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure in? Sales transactions, not all transactions, because all transactions include leases, and we don't use that document in leases. Just saying. Do they have to sign the Working with Real Estate Agents brochure? They do not. They do not. It doesn't create an agency relationship. They don't have to sign it. You can still work with them if they do not sign it. All that good stuff. That's it for Chapter 7. See, that wasn't so bad. All right, let's do Chapter 8, and then I think we'll wrap it for tonight. How about that? Okay. 8 chapters in one night. Pretty impressive, isn't it? Exactly. Yes, and you'd probably jump off of a bridge on the way home on the third night. Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's a good business model, right? As long as they paid up front, it's like, and sell them some life insurance on the way in, right? Oh, now I got to open a funeral home. Okay. I'm so glad this is all on YouTube. So, page 187, agency contracts. Obviously, the basis of our business is the listing agreement. The listing agreement is the foundation of this business. And every listing agreement must be in what? Writing from its very beginning. Okay? On page 188, they get into the solicitation rules. Okay? And the biggest one here is going to be the do not call registry. You're going to need to remember the rules about the do not call registry. So, if somebody's on the do not call registry, are you supposed to call them? Not unless they give you what? Permission. So, give me some examples of how they could give me permission. A FSBO, and I have a what? And I have a buyer who's interested in their property. Now, if I am calling to solicit the listing, is being a FSBO giving me permission to call? No, I cannot call them to solicit the listing just because they're a FSBO. I can call them if I have a buyer that's interested in the property, but I cannot have any conversation at all with them about listing their property. Now, and this is, of course, if they're on the do not call registry. This is all assuming that they're actually on the. If they're not on the do not call registry, I can call them for any reason. Okay? So assuming they're on the do not call registry, FSBO is good if I have a buyer, but not to solicit the listing. What's other examples of permission to call? If I did business with them, so I actually did a transaction with them, I represented them or somehow did a transaction with them, how long after that transaction ends can I continue to call them? 18 months. 18 months if I actually did a transaction with them. It's 18 months. What's the last way I could have permission to call? They requested some information. They called me off of my sign. They went on my website. They came to an open house and wrote down their phone number. Those are all examples of requesting me to call. How long is that permission good for? 3 months. That's the 3-month one. So it's 3 months if it's just sort of a casual, hey, I'd like to get this information request. If you actually did business with them, then it's 18 months. Everybody good on that? Okay. Obviously, there are also laws that govern email and fax. As with the CAN-SPAM Act, the email, what do you need to know about that? Have to have an opt-out. Have to have a way to opt out of that. Now, on the bottom of page 189, it talks about antitrust laws. The most common one that we have to be worried about is something called price-fixing laws. So price fixing is when we make it sound like there's sort of standardized pricing across our whole industry, that everybody charges the same thing. So what do we have to be very careful to make sure that clients understand? Commissions are always what? Always negotiable. Clients have to understand that commissions are always negotiable. And that's number one. Number two, don't ever say things like standard rate, going rate, the normal rate. You say things like, this is what I charge, this is what we charge, this is what my firm charges. Those are the appropriate ways to approach it. The other thing is, be very careful about saying things like, well, I'm not going to show their listing because they don't pay buyer's agents. Or they don't pay enough to buyer's agents, so I'm not going to show. Or I'm going to go show this listing because they're paying 5% and these other guys only paying 2%. You can't shut people out of the business because of what they're paying or what they're not paying. That's what your buyer agency agreement's for. Your buyer agency agreement's supposed to establish what you're going to be paid, because it says that you're going to attempt to get it from the seller, but if you can't, who will pay you? The buyer, and therefore that frees you up to show any property. So don't try to shut people out or freeze people out. That goes under antitrust laws. Don't try to freeze out service providers or vendors. I mean, let's say there's an inspector and everybody's like, God, I hate when he inspects my listings. He just nitpicks the hell out of them. I mean, it's like 80 pages and the buyer thinks the house is going to blow up and fall on their head just as soon as they walk in the door. And then every deal falls apart. So listen, I'm not going to send him any business. You don't send him any business. If none of us send him any business, he'll be out of business. No. That is also an example of an antitrust violation. So be aware of all of that. That's called group boycotting is what that one's called. But
you can't tell them, you wouldn't say, these are some people I do recommend.
You can certainly recommend service providers, absolutely.
But just kind of keep them out of it if you really don't want. You just can't say, I don't recommend this guy. Right?
Well, you could even say, I don't recommend this person, but what you can't do is coordinate with other brokers to do the same thing. If they all come to that individual conclusion and they all end up doing it, that's okay. But it's the collusion aspect of it that gets us in trouble. We like to talk. Okay. On page 190, the bottom of page 190, broker's entitlement to a commission. Procuring cause is a good phrase. What's the big one that we look for? Ready, willing, and able buyer. That we have earned a commission. We're entitled to a commission when we've produced a ready, willing, and able buyer. However, we're probably not going to collect the commission until what's actually happened. Until we've closed, which is recording of the deed. That's generally speaking when we would collect on a commission. We might have earned it sooner than that. And in fact, should our listing agreements and buyer agency agreements outline exactly when we have earned the commission? I mean, shouldn't that be part of the agency agreement to say we've earned the commission when this happens? Yeah, that's a big part of it. Let's see, on page 207. Page 207. You've got the different types of listing agreements. And I'm actually going to skip over to page 208. I'm going to work backwards because I'm going to give you the one that's most common first. the exclusive right to sell listing. Under what circumstances have we earned a commission when we have an exclusive right to sell listing agreement? Any buyer purchases the property. Any buyer from any source purchases the property. And there's three potential sources, right? My firm could produce a buyer. That's number one. What's number two? A cooperating firm, a different firm could produce the buyer, or the seller could sell it themselves. Those are the three possibilities. And in an exclusive right to sell, it doesn't matter which one of them comes into play, the firm is owed a commission. Does that make sense for everybody? Now, how about the exclusive agency listing? In the exclusive agency listing, first of all, we're still only hiring how many firms? One firm, because we got that word exclusive. Let's talk about the three instances. Our firm produces a buyer. Do we still get paid? Yes. Cooperating firm produces a buyer. Do we still get paid? Yes. Seller sells it themselves. Do we still get paid? No. In an exclusive agency listing, the seller can sell the property themselves and not pay a commission. And then finally, the open listing. Yeah, craziness. Three instances. My firm produces a buyer. Do we get paid? A cooperating firm produces a buyer. Do I get paid? No. As a matter of fact, there can't be any such thing as a cooperating firm under an open listing. Seller sells it themselves. Do we get paid? No. So only if our firm produces a buyer do we get paid. And we've lost that word exclusive, so now the buyer can hire how many firms? As many as they want. As many as they want.
Well, they ask a question like trying to trick you on that one because I know there is one where the seller sold it, but you had your signs there and everything. You just had to find the proof that on the exclusive. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're asking. So it's an exclusive listing, okay? And you're saying what happened?
No, I know a while back you said something on. No. I got it.
Oh, that's the exclusive. I know exactly what the exclusive agency listing, because the seller sold it themselves.
Yeah.
In an exclusive agency listing, the seller can sell it themselves and not pay us a commission, which is different than the exclusive right to sell. In the exclusive right to sell, it doesn't matter who sells it. We sell it, another firm sells it, seller sells it themselves. We get paid in every single circumstance. If the property gets sold, we get paid in the exclusive right to sell. Whereas in the exclusive agency, the seller produces the buyer, we don't get paid.
Yeah, that was my question.
Okay? In the exclusive agency listing, if the seller produces the buyer, we do not get paid. Okay? Is everybody good on those? Because I'm pretty sure you'll have to identify one of those three. You know, they'll give you a description of one of those three. Let's see here. As far as buyer agency agreements, they're pretty much the same as the listing agreement. Big exception to the buyer agency agreement is that it can be in what? Or can be not in what? It can be oral. It can be not in writing for a limited amount of time until we do what? Present an offer. But let's talk about that oral buyer agency for a second. Is it exclusive? No. It is not exclusive. Can it be exclusive? No. Can we bind that buyer to only work with us? Only if we put it in writing. So as long as it's oral, it is non-exclusive. Can it be for some limited amount of time? No. There is no real agreement. The buyer can go do whatever they want to do with an oral agreement. Any limitation on the buyer whatsoever takes what kind of an agreement? A written agreement. Okay, so make sure you know that when they're talking about oral buyer agency. You know, it's got to have words like non-exclusive. It's going to be it's never going to be for a certain amount of time. It's always going to be just completely open, willy-nilly, free as the wind. That's what oral buyer agency is. From both perspectives. Free as the wind sounds great until you realize the other party's also free as the wind. That doesn't work so well. Sounds great from my perspective, but not from the other people's perspective. Okay? Make sure you're okay with splitting commissions. No.
I quit.
You want that whole 6%, right? So make sure on the test you're okay with the math of splitting commissions. Make sure you know how to use the commission tree so that you can split those commissions into 4 pieces and come up with one of those 4 pieces and how much somebody would be paid. Okay? Is a listing agreement a guarantee to sell? No, absolutely not. I mean, it's going to be, obviously, it's going to have statements about what our duties are to try to sell the property, but it's never going to say we guarantee to sell your property. That's not what a listing agreement is for. That would be a very bad move on our part. Absolutely. It would be a... We've had people make those kinds of guarantees, if I can't sell it. But that's the thing, if you start looking at the fine print, when I've looked into those in the past, most of the time what you find is you have to list it at a price, they price it, and they have an appraisal done, and they price it 10% less than the appraisal, and then you have to agree to take price reductions every 30 days for 6 months, and then and only then if it doesn't sell, they'll buy it. So the real estate commission does not like that. Yeah, exactly. They do not like that at all. Over on page... I'm sorry?
On the oral buyer agency agreement,
Uh-huh.
is it a customer or a client?
They're clients, because even an oral buyer agency agreement is a buyer agency agreement. It's just not a very strong one. I mean...
Agency there.
There's an agency relationship there. We owe them loads. We treat them like an exclusive client as long as we can. When would that change? When if we have an oral buyer agency agreement. So what I mean when I say we treat them like an exclusive client is that, do we keep their information confidential? Yes. Do we provide them advice? Yes. Do we give them skill, care, and diligence and all that good stuff? Yes. Until what happens? What potential conflict could come up that would knock us out of the park on that thing with an oral buyer agency? It's not going to be dual agency, because if they look at a listing with our firm and we don't have a written buyer agency agreement, whose team do we default to? The seller's team, because we do have a written agreement with that seller. Right? So that's when that buyer would definitely want to put that buyer agency agreement into writing, because at that point they need to protect themselves. Okay, that help? Good. Good. As far as things that should be in the listing agreement, clearly the commission. All your agency agreements should have the commission stated and how it's earned, what you have to do to earn it, when it's owed, how the commission is going to be split between your firm and a cooperating firm. That should be in there. A description of the property you're selling. All those things are part of the... What is the extender clause in a listing agreement or buyer agency agreement? That's in the sales contract. What's the extender clause in an agency agreement?
If somebody else, your listing ends and they're going at, they find sell it to somebody and you're the cause of actually showing that.
So somebody who became interested in the property when it was listed with me ends up buying it after my listing does what? Expires. You still owe me a commission.
But you gotta write down all the
unless you do what? unless the seller does what? Gets a new firm. They list it with somebody else. That kills the extender clause. So make sure you understand what the extender clause is. It's a protection period after my listing expires, where I would still be owed a commission if a buyer who I introduced to the property, so basically somebody who looked at the property while I had it listed, if they end up buying it after my listing expires, I'm still owed the commission as long as the seller didn't do what? Hire another firm. If they hire a new firm, who's going to get paid the commission? The new firm.
And the term is however much you want it to be.
It's a negotiable period of time.
you have to provide a list of all the people.
You got to give them a list of the people that are going to be protected under it. Exactly. it's very involved. Very involved. So you're probably never going to actually enforce it. Yeah, he might. He might.
If it's over, it's over. There ain't no going back.
Who is the most common source of holding an earnest money deposit in North Carolina? Mm-mm. Which firm? Not selling firm. Listing firm. Put that in your notes. The most common place for earnest money deposit. Think about the listing agreement. Remember we went through that listing agreement? We said there's a paragraph in there that said if any earnest money is forfeited to the seller, then that earnest money will be what? Remember that? Split between the listing firm and the seller. That's what the listing agreement says. The exclusive right to sell listing says that if the seller gets forfeited any earnest money, that money is going to be split between the seller and the listing firm. So how's the best way to make sure you get your half of the money? You're the one who's holding it in the first place. So what's the most common place for an earnest money deposit to be held? The listing firm. The listing firm.
They have their own escrow account.
They have a trust account. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Page 227. Square footage. Is that a material fact? Is it a material fact? No, it is not. It is typically done because we are generally expected by our clients to do it, right? The market sort of demands it. So even though it's not a material fact, are we responsible for being accurate with it if we choose to disclose it? Yes, we are. And does the Real Estate Commission have certain rules about how to be accurate with it? They do. Where do you measure? Outside. Exterior measurements. You only take interior measurements when you absolutely cannot measure outside, right? Is everybody good with that? And if you have to measure inside, what do you do for the exterior walls? You add 6 inches for each wall. Okay, if you have to measure inside, because think about it, if you're measuring inside, isn't it going to be smaller than it is if you measure outside? So you're just trying to make up for not being able to measure outside. You add 6 inches for each of the walls. What's the number one requirement of living area in this state? Permanently heated. Number one requirement. If it's not permanently heated, folks, it's not living area. Not space heaters, not portable heaters, permanent heat. Permanent heat. And what's the other requirement? I know we got a minimum ceiling height and interior finish, but directly what? Directly accessible from other living area. You can, and it has to be finished. You can't leave one finished area and go to an unfinished area and then go to another finished area. It doesn't work that way. It has to all be contiguous. In other words, every piece of living area has to be directly accessed from another piece of living area. Is everybody good on that? Okay. Make sure you're good on those. And who measures it? An appraiser or listing broker. What things can you not use for square footage? Previous listings. What else? Old appraisals. What else? What about tax records? Nope. Absolutely not. On what floor are the stairs considered living area? Both floors. Good. Good. On what floor are the stairs considered living area? Which floor? Both. So if it's a two-story house, which floor are the stairs living area? The first and the second, right? They count in the floor space of both floors. Page 228, 229, the Residential Property Disclosure Act. So the Act requires that most sellers provide this form. There are some exemptions, but most sellers are required to provide this form to the buyer before they do what? Before they make an offer on the property. They're supposed to provide this form to the buyer before the buyer. Remember, almost everything, when I say before, the answer is time of offer. The only exception to that is the working real estate agent's brochure, and that's before you exchange personal confidential information. Everything else is no later than time of offer. Okay? So, the Residential Property Disclosure Act says the seller should provide this form to the buyer no later than time of offer. What if they don't? The buyer has 3 days after the contract is formed to do what? To back out, to terminate, and get what back? All of it. Earnest money, due diligence fee, the whole 9 yards. Get all their money back. Is everybody good on that? Should brokers ever fill out this form? No. We provide it to them. We ask them to fill it out. We don't ever answer the questions on here, though. Same rules are true for the mineral oil and gas statements, the same 3-day period.
And they can't ask for help.
You shouldn't give them any advice about filling it out. Fill it out best they can. Absolutely.
So does the buyer beware fall under tolerance or?
So buyer beware deals with this form. Basically, the seller can check no representation on any of those answers.
Did you tell the buyer about their 3-day right to walk away if it's not?
Adam's question was, should I tell the buyer about their 3-day right to walk away? Yes, particularly if I'm on the buyer side of the transaction. It's actually right there in the contract, though. There's if you use the standard offer to purchase and contract, it has 3 options. You have to check one. It says buyer has received a copy of the disclosure statement, buyer has not received a copy of the disclosure statement, and the property is exempt from the disclosure statement. Those are the 3 choices, and you have to check one of those 3. And if you check the one that says buyer has not received, there's a note there that says buyer shall have the right to terminate this contract for 3 days after contract form. It's right there. So exemptions are for new construction. That's the biggest exemption. Foreclosures are also exempt because the owner of the property has no way to disclose it. They don't know.
So if they choose no representation and like you saw a big stain on the ceiling, you have to tell them that they need to adjust their no representation if there's a material fact?
No, you don't tell them give them any advice about that form. What you tell them is, my answers have no bearing on your answers and vice versa. You may answer no representation, but I'm going to still disclose it. You know, so you don't tell them they need to change because that would be filling out the form for them.
And so where do you disclose that there's a leak and your seller doesn't want to fix it?
You can do it on the listing. That's where I would do it, on the listing itself.
You just put it in like the comments.
Put it in the comments, yeah. Put it in the comments on the MLS. There's a suspected leak or there's a known leak or whatever it is.
And then there's an argument between you and the seller.
Well, and they can fix it then. Yeah, that's a real world thing. You got to have that discussion. I mean, so as a buyer's agent, if you want to get leverage for your client, the first thing you should always do after you get an inspection report is send it to the seller. Send it to the seller even before you send it to a buyer. Because now you have just put it on the seller that if you do terminate and walk away, they've got to disclose every single thing in that inspection report to any subsequent buyers. That if you terminate your contract, everything that's in that 42 pages of that inspection report is now a material fact that has to be disclosed. And you make sure that they understand that you're going to haunt them like the demon you are to make sure they do that. Because you're advocating for the buyer at that point, right? And the best way to advocate for the seller to make repairs for your buyer is to make it clear to them that they are never going to be able to market this property without either making these repairs or telling everybody about them. And good luck getting an offer when you tell everybody that the heat exchanger is cracked and you're going to die of carbon monoxide poisoning.
You're all gonna die, don't even know.
I've had that very discussion with a listing agent. I said, exactly. Now, I said, Jack, explain exactly now to me how you're going to tell buyers that they're going to die the first night they live in this house. Because that's what you got to disclose here, you know. Because when we had the HVAC inspection, they literally red tagged it. They literally turned the gas off, put a red tag on it, and said the house could not be occupied with that system in operation. And the seller said, well, we're not replacing it. I said, that's fine. You don't have to. But you do have to tell every subsequent buyer that they will die who lives there. Good luck with that. You know what they did? They replaced it. Shocker, right? But that's where you have to know how the material fact disclosure rules work and use them to the power of your client, because you have to put the seller in that position. And don't worry, it's going to happen to you. You're going to be on the seller side sometime, and somebody's going to do that, and you're like, "Arr," you know. It works both ways.
How are they surviving this potential?
It's a good question. I don't know. Maybe they weren't, which wouldn't have to be disclosed. That's stigmatized, right? They didn't have to tell us that. Maybe they didn't survive. Who knows? All right. I think that is about it for Chapter 8. Just make sure, again, that you're okay with the math of splitting compensation.
We came to the conclusion, E, no.
Good, productive night, I think.